Hello, Soundside Church family. My name is Tim Howe. I'm a member of Soundside Church, and I'm a minister in the Northwest. Today, I'll be bringing the message from the story of Daniel. And in the series that we're doing right now, we're looking at the important stories of the Bible that we all should know. And Daniel is one of those individuals that I love to share his story. We won't get to the entire story because the book of Daniel is a large book. But Daniel is one of those characters in the Bible that you just don't find anything wrong about him. You look at the stories of David or of Abraham or of Moses, you can always find something that they did that was displeasing to the Lord. Daniel's entire story is one of a person who was faithful and pleasing to the Lord, he and his friends. And so today we're going to look at a few of the stories that you find in the book of Daniel, principally about Daniel, but also including his friends. The story of Daniel begins in Judea. It's the end of the nation of Judah as they've been unfaithful to the Lord. The Lord has brought in enemies that have caused them to be punished. And in this case, it's Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Babylonians, has come and he's attacked the city of Jerusalem, and he's gathered up a bunch of young people, taking them back into his capital city in Babylon. And so he's taking these back. He's picking out the choice people, the ones who look good, who are physically fit. His men are finding these individuals and carting them off, and Daniel is one of those, and so are three of his friends, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. These young men were important. They had studied. They were from important families, and now they're being taken off into a hostile land. When they land in this new land, they quickly are inspected and determines that they should fit into the leadership structure of Babylon. That's a practice that Babylon liked to do. They would bring these people in and try to convert them to be Babylonians and take the best from their exploits and make them part of their ruling class. And so these four promising young men are put into this home where they're going to be studying with others like them from other provinces that have been taken over by the Babylonians, and they're going to be raised to be leaders in the government of Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. And while they're there, there's a man that's charged with taking care of them. And he comes and brings them the food and the wine that they're expected to eat and to drink while they're learning and they're studying. And he tells them, this is for your own good. This is the choicest food that you can find in Babylon. Daniel is obviously, I can't imagine how much he must have experienced at this point, decided to stay true to who he is as a faithful follower of Yahweh. And he looks at the food and the wine that's offered, and it's something about it, and this text doesn't tell us what it is, but something about it is at odds with his faith. And so he tells the guy that's in charge of him, me and my friends, we don't want to eat this food. It's going to dishonor God. It could be that it was offered as idols. It could be that it had certain items in it, such as pork, that they weren't allowed to eat. But he saw this as dishonoring to the Lord. And so he tells the man that's in charge of him, we don't want to eat this food. And what a step for a young man to make, right, in this situation. And the ruler's worried because he says, listen, if you don't measure up, it's against me. Because my bosses are going to come back and say, why are you not taking care of these if they find out you're not eating the food? So I really want you to eat this food. It's the best food that we have in the land. And Daniel and his friends reiterate, we don't want to eat the Babylonian food. We want to stay true to worshiping our God and remaining separate in the ways that we think are important. So this dietary requirement is part of that. He says, but I'll tell you what, if you will feed us vegetables and water for 10 days and come and check on us, and if we look worse than all the other people in the same program, then you can give us the choicest foods that you want. But if you come back and you see that we're actually doing better, can we stay on the diet that we have selected? And the man thinks about it. He says, that sounds like a good idea. So he does that. And this whole time that they are eating this food, they're also studying. And the scriptures say that at the end of that 10 days, they look fitter than the other men in the program, but they also are wiser. In fact, the scriptures go on to say that they were 10 times wiser, and they're able to not just be full of knowledge and understanding, but they had a good perception of truth. 10 times wiser is what the text says than the other men in the program. And so this person who's in charge of them realizes, oh, they are actually doing well, and I can keep giving them this food. And Daniel was able to therefore not compromise his faith and still show himself as someone who was valuable. At the end of this time, they were seen as 10 times wiser than all the men in Babylon, all the magicians and all the wise men. And so they were given authority, as it was expected that they would, once they finished this program, at a level that was equal to what was better than anyone else in the program. And so that's the first story we see of Daniel Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, that they were faithful to the Lord. About this time, they're given new names as they're taking into this new country. They're given Babylonian names. Daniel is given the name Belteshazzar. Hananiah is given the name Shadrach. Mishael is given the name Meshach. And Azariah is given the name Abednego. These men continue to serve the Lord in this foreign land that's different than where they left, while they eventually hear about the destruction of their homeland. As they've been given their different responsibilities in the government, they're trying to serve the Lord faithfully. They're now within this group of men called wise men, diviners, magicians, mediums. There's a group of these people that are now working for the king, and they're giving certain responsibilities to take care of the people. Some of them are like government type officials. Some of them are like advisors to the king or to his people. And it's those men that have the responsibilities of all these duties in the nation that basically make Babylon operate. So it's no small thing. Later on, King Nebuchadnezzar was asleep in his own bed, and he was troubled by a dream. And he woke up and wanted to know what that dream meant. And so he went to his chief magicians and diviners and wise men and mediums and said to them, "Hey, can you interpret my dream for me? Because it bothered me last night." And they said, "Oh, king, of course, we're very, very happy to interpret your dream. Just tell us what your dream is, and we will interpret it for you." And King Nebuchadnezzar says, "No, I know your patterns. You just tell me what I want to hear, or you tell me things that aren't true. I want you to tell me what the dream is, and then tell me the interpretation, and I will know that it's true." And so the wise men, the diviners, the magicians, the mediums, they came back to the king and said, "Oh, king, we would love to interpret your dream for you one more time, but we need to know what the dream is. So just tell us the dream, and we will interpret it again for you." And the king becomes angry, and he says, "No, I've told you," and he pressed them. He says, "I've told you that I don't trust what you say oftentimes, and I want you to tell me what the dream is. Therefore, I will be able to trust your interpretation." The men said, "No king has ever asked, however great he is, has ever asked us of such thing of their wise men. How can we possibly know what your dream is?" He said, "No God in heaven is going to speak to people on earth and reveal such a thing. This is something reserved for the gods. And so if you will just tell us the dream, then we can interpret it." So they, for a third time, said the same thing. And now the king becomes indignant. He says, "No, you've failed me too many times." So he orders that they be killed. And not just them, he says, "I want all the wise men, the magicians, the mediums, the diviners in the land to be executed, because they're all untruthful. They're all unfaithful." And so this decree goes out. Well, that includes the 4 men from Judah, because that's what they've been trained to become. So Arioch, as one of the king's men, comes to do his duty, and that's to execute Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. And when he shows up, Daniel says, "Why such a harsh decree? What's going on?" And so Arioch explains what's happened, that the king wants this dream interpreted, but he wants them to understand what the dream is. And so Daniel tells Arioch, I can do this. He goes, "I can petition the Lord to see if he will reveal the dream to me." So Arioch goes to the king and says, "One of the Judeans who you brought from the land of Judah says he can do this thing if you give him time." So Nebuchadnezzar says, "Okay." He relents, and Daniel goes back with his friends, and they pray fervently, and they pray, "God, please reveal to us this dream and reveal its interpretation as well." And so Daniel goes back, and that evening he understands the dream, and he understands its meaning as well. And so he tells Arioch tells the king, and Daniel is brought before Nebuchadnezzar and tells Nebuchadnezzar the dream. He says, "Oh, great king, you are the king of kings. You are the mighty king of all the land. And I will tell you what your dream is, and then I will tell you what that means." And so Nebuchadnezzar says, "Go ahead, I'm listening." And so Daniel tells him, he said, "There's a statue in your dream, and it's 90 feet tall, and it's a wide statue, and at the top is gold. The head is made of gold. And then the chest area is made of silver. And then the section below that, the belly and the thigh section, is made of bronze. The legs are made of iron, and the feet are made of a mixture of iron and fired clay." And the king's kind of nodding, and he says, "That is my dream." And Daniel says, "Well, let me tell you what that means." He says, "O King of Kings, as I've said before, you're the mighty king, and the gold on top represents your kingdom. It's the greatest kingdom in all of the earth. Nothing like it before, nothing like it coming after. And you are the epitome of that kingdom. It's the golden kingdom. That's why it's gold. But after you, your kingdom will be taken over by a different kingdom. And that kingdom is going to be a less mighty kingdom, and that's why it's represented by silver. But it's still going to be an important kingdom. It's going to be a big kingdom in all the land. After that, it's going to be another kingdom that will take over that kingdom. And this one will be a less glorious kingdom, but it's going to be one that rules the whole land. And that's going to be a king that's represented by the bronze. And then that kingdom will eventually be taken over by an even stronger kingdom. That's represented by the iron. And that kingdom will be the strongest kingdom that's ever lived on earth. And it's going to be so powerful that it's going to be able to rule the people with an iron fist. But eventually that kingdom is going to start to separate. And as it separates, they're going to fight against each other. And that's where that representation of the toes, of the feet, and of the clay and the iron mixed together represents that there's this great division that's going to take place in it. But in the dream, a giant ball is going to come, and a big giant ball of earth is going to come, and it's going to hit this statue. And that statue is going to bust the bottom portion of it. And then when it does, the statue is going to fall. And then the iron itself is going to break apart. And when it does, it's going to break all of the entire statue up. So the bronze and the silver and the gold, and they're going to be broken into tiny pieces. And like chaff is blown by the wind, these are going to be blown away. And the entire statue is going to disappear. And then this ball of clay that lands on the earth is going to turn into a mountain, and it's going to fill the land, and it will never diminish. He says, King, that ball represents the final kingdom that's going to come. And as iron is so sharp and it destroys everything, when it breaks that iron kingdom, it symbolizes all these others being destroyed. Because this one that's going to destroy the last kingdom is going to destroy all kingdoms. And when it does so, it's going to be established forever, that God's going to establish a new king on earth that will be permanent. And it will never be moved. And that's what the mountain and all of the earth represents. When Nebuchadnezzar heard the dream and the interpretation of the dream from Daniel, he tells him, you are mightier than all the others. You are greater in your wisdom and your knowledge and your interpretation. And so he sets Daniel up as a leader in the government of the province of Babylon. And he makes him a ruler, a governor, if you will, of this region because of his intellect. And then 3 friends he sets up as provincial leaders within the province of different magistrates. And so they all are given greater responsibilities and greater duties as a result. And their God of these, Yahweh, is praised by Nebuchadnezzar and praised by the people that see the wisdom of these men who did not compromise their faith, but lived their faith in a difficult and trying place. Now, I would like to end the story there and say everything was fine. These 3 men ended up being, honored, and everyone respected them. And Daniel was as well. But we know that throughout the book of Daniel, trouble follows all of them. And then Daniel chapter 3, it talks about the story that follows the 3 friends. Now, by this point, they're called more commonly by their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they are now satraps, or they're rulers of provinces. They're not ruler in the same sense as Daniel. He's kind of a high ruler. They're rulers of smaller sections. They're kind of magistrates, if you will. There comes a time when Nebuchadnezzar decides he needs to be worshipped himself. And maybe he has this dream of this vision. We know later in the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar starts to have some mental health issues. Maybe this is the beginning of it. But whatever the case may be, he decides he needs to have a statue made to himself. And it's this giant statue that is also 90 feet tall. It's 9 feet wide. And he wants it set out on the plain. And then all these leaders from other lands, but also Babylonians, that are now leading different provinces or different sections of provinces, they're government officials, if you will, they're required to go out into this plain. And when the trumpets blast, they're all supposed to bow down and worship this statue that represents their obedience or their submission to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is a bit of a megalomaniac at this point, has told them that you can't get out of this, you must do this. So all these leaders, these rulers come out there, these satraps, these governors, these government officials show up in this plain like they're required to do. The statue has been built and it's there in the plain. And sure enough, when the trumpets are played, everyone bows down to worship this statue, except for 3 of the government officials. And that's these 3 young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or from their Hebrew names, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. the officials in the moment are very troubled. They're like, why are they not worshiping Nebuchadnezzar? He's the king. Why are they not bowing down to them? And they say, well, we want to honor our God and we will bow before no other. We worship Yahweh alone and we will only bend our knee to him. And they're like, this isn't good. You have to do this or it's going to be punishable by death. And the word gets back to Nebuchadnezzar and he says, okay, we're going to throw them in the fiery furnace. We're going to create this big giant pit of fire and we're going to put anyone in it who doesn't bow down to the statue. And these guys are the ones we're going to throw in as an example. And so he brings the young men to him and says, this is your last chance. We're going to blow the trumpets. We want you to bow down. And they explain to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, we respect you as king, but we will not bend our knee to anyone but Yahweh. And so if they blow these trumpets again this time around, we will again not bow down. And this makes the king even more angry. He says, so heat up the furnace as much as you possibly can. Throw 7 times as much fuel in there to make it hot as it can possibly be. So we make sure that these guys understand what they're saying. They're going to be killed when they're thrown in this fire. And so they do that. This now raging inferno is taking place. And the king says, we're going to blow the trumpets and you're going to be expected to bow down. But the men don't. They refuse. And one of the men stands up and says, King, we know that our God, Yahweh, can deliver us even from your fiery pit, from the furnace. But even if he doesn't, we will not worship any other. That's a curious phrase. They know that God could, but even if he doesn't, we will not worship another. So Nebuchadnezzar orders them to be bound and thrown in the furnace. And as they're being carried to the furnace, it says the flames are so hot that it kills the men who tosses them into the furnace. And all 3 of them are tossed into the furnace. And Nebuchadnezzar immediately looks in and says, didn't we just throw 3 men in there? And his officials around him say, yeah, that's right. He says, then why do we see 4 in there? For the scripture says that the angel of the Lord was in the furnace with him. There were 4 of them there together. And so they were walking around. They seemed to be fine. They weren't being burnt up, even though they were surrounded by fire. A fire so hot that it killed the men who threw them into the furnace. And so the king calls to them to come out. And they come back out. And he says, now I know that Yahweh is great. Now I know that the God of the Judeans is not a trifle. And we will not require you to do this thing. And so the name of Yahweh gains favor in Babylon. And these men are able to show faith in God. There's one more story from the book of Daniel that I want to share. These are all familiar stories. We should be aware of them, but it's good to remember them. And this story takes place much later. As Nebuchadnezzar had his dream and the statue indicated that his kingdom would end, it was eventually destroyed by the Medes and Persians. They captured Babylon and made it part of their kingdom. And eventually a Persian king by the name of Darius had favor on Daniel, and he really highly respected him. And Daniel was much older later. And he thought so highly of Daniel that he made him an official that was very high in his own government, just like Nebuchadnezzar had done in the Babylonian government. And Daniel became renowned by all the people. He was respected highly. He was favored by the king, and the other government officials began to be jealous of him. In fact, he was going to be given leadership over all of the government officials. And they decided to conspire against him. They were looking for some way to cause Daniel to be punished by the king or to lose face and not be able to have this position of authority over them. And they concluded among themselves, we can't find any fault with Daniel. He's a great man. He's a good man, except for relating to his God. He only worships his God. He does so fervently. So they came up with a scheme, and they went to Darius and said, oh, Darius, for 30 days, we want this entire nation to just pay homage to you and to say how great you are. So we're going to ask that no person pray to another god or submit to another human while they pay homage to you for a 30-day period. And Darius thought that's a great idea. So they had him write it into law. And they codified it in the Medo-Persian law books so that it was sealed by the king and could not be changed, even by the king himself. And then a short time later, Daniel hears about this and he says, I'm not going to change what I do. So he opens his windows toward Jerusalem, where he had been taken from when he was a boy. And he goes and he prays to Yahweh, who has had his temple in Jerusalem. And he's doing what he's always done. And the men catch him in it. And they go back and they report to Darius. And he says, oh, Darius, this guy, he's doing stuff that's not right. Oh, it's Daniel, the one you like so much. He keeps worshiping this other God. And the king Darius is now regretting what he's decided. He goes, well, we won't worry about that because he's just honoring his God. And they said, oh, no, king, you signed a decree that not even you yourself can change. And the decree required that he be thrown into a den of lions. And Darius is grieved in his heart, and he's trying to figure out how he can get out of this day and night. It takes a whole day to think about it, all night long, and finally in the morning realizes there's nothing that can be done. And so he has to abide by the law that he himself has established. And so they call Daniel and they tell Daniel that you're going to be thrown in this den of lions and they're probably going to devour him, right? That's what would happen normally. And Darius then tells Daniel, may your God protect you. And he says, I'll be praying for you tonight. And the king is wrestling all night because he cares for Daniel. He doesn't want this to happen, but he signed this decree that he can't break. And Daniel's thrown in the den. They put a rock over the wall. The king himself seals it with his signet to show that no one can come in and out of there and rescue Daniel. And in the morning, when the king wakes up, the first thing he does, he goes to the stone. They roll the stone back, and he yells out to him. He says, oh, Daniel, has your God rescued you? Has he delivered you from the lions? And Daniel responds, don't worry, I'm fine. And the text says that the Lord had closed the mouth of the lions that probably were hungry and obviously were vicious, and that Daniel was protected. And so the king orders he be taken out. He then turns his wrath on the men that have done this evil thing, that have conspired against Daniel, and he has them tossed into the den themselves and their family, the text says. And it says before they fully hit the ground, they had been attacked by the lions. And it says the lions crushed them and devoured them. And instead, King Darius gave praise to the God of Daniel, and says, your God is the true God that reigns over all the nations. And as a result, he did put Daniel in the position of authority that he had intended to from the beginning, and Yahweh was praised. That's just 4 stories from the book of Daniel. It tells us the stories of Daniel that some of us have heard from childhood, that we all should be aware of it. I picked these out because they're the most well-known, but I also picked them out because they all tell us the same consistent theme, that these young men who grew up probably in faithful households where they learned from their parents the truth about Yahweh that they worshiped in Jerusalem, that even when situations changed and they found themselves in an environment that was not as inviting of their faith, in fact, it was against their faith. And we've seen multiple episodes where they were required to do something that was against their conscience, whether it be what they eat, who they worshiped, how they worshiped, that they did not compromise. And instead, they stood firm in a society while still maintaining a good name in that society. And as a result, every one of these stories, we see God worshiped in a new way at the end of the story because of their presence among a people who look different than them. You and I don't find ourselves in a similar situation. We weren't dragged off in captivity into a new land, but it does feel like sometimes we're in a land that is hostile to our faith, that we live in a place and time where it's hard for us to live our faith out. But the truth of the matter is that we're not facing the challenges that they faced. And as they were faithful, we can be faithful. God has called us to be witnesses right where we are. And even as things become even more foreign, or we find ourselves in places that are antagonistic to the gospel, we can still have a gospel presence. We can still maintain our faith in those circumstances, and we can exhibit God at work in those circumstances. So I hope today most of us have probably heard a story you've heard many times, and one of these stories are the most famous stories in the book of Daniel. But I hope it's a reminder that we are not alone, and we're not the first to experience persecution or being at odds in a culture that doesn't appreciate our faith. Instead, we're part of a long line of tradition that goes back to these men and before these men, and lots of people in between from then till now around the world who've maintained their faith and faithfulness in a time and in a place where that wasn't easy. May we learn from their stories and live in such a way. God bless you guys. Let's close in a word of prayer. Dear Lord, I pray that I start with myself, can be faithful in the circumstances where I find myself. If I find myself with people that don't appreciate who you are, don't believe in you, Lord, I can still live in a way that's faithful. I can have a faith that overcomes my circumstances. Lord, I also pray that as in all of these cases, you were worshiped because of the faithfulness of these men, that there can be people that can see you through what I do. Not because I'm honoring, I'm great. Daniel actually told Nebuchadnezzar he didn't interpret his dream because he was wise. He interpreted because you revealed it to him. So I pray that you reveal yourself through our circumstances to the people around us. Lord, we ask your blessings. We thank you for the good things that come from you. It's in your name we pray. Amen. God bless you all this Sunday.